Hello and welcome back to Colonial Outcasts, the anti-imperialist podcast that will hopefully really piss off your uncle, both right-wing and further right-wing. And by right-wing, I do mean Democrat. So, first of all, we are going to be talking about a number of things today. It is Tuesday, October 29th or October 30th, depending on where you live. We're getting a late start, recording at 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time because its exigencies. November 5th, the election. So essentially, I'm going to be taking a break for the next 7 days. I'm going to be disappearing into the high desert just to do my own thing. Don't even worry about it. But I will be returning November 6th with post-election commentary because if you loved 2024, you're going to absolutely love 2025. So we're also on Patreon. We're going to be doing a live Q&A tomorrow before I head out, and also releasing a comedic hour-long episode. So if you want to check that out and support the channel and what we're trying to do here, we always really appreciate it. Today, we are joined by series regular contributor Alina Xenofontos. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me, Greg.
Okay, so today we've got Iran, we've got BRICS, we've got Southern Lebanon, and I might touch on the presidential elections that are going to happen on November 5th, but that's a thorny subject. Nobody's excited about it. Everyone's pissing me off about it. So I think, we might just touch on that at the end. But first of all, we're going to begin with something that happened Friday, and everybody's still talking about it. I gave my initial reaction on Al Jazeera, basically without knowing a lot of information, basically just talking in general terms, that it looked pretty performative. It didn't look like any serious damage was done, at least to populated centers where people were recording with their phones. Iran obviously played it down. Israel played it up. But I just wanted to show you, because we like to give imperialist propagandist media a platform on here just so we can pick it apart. And I think it's this one. So if you're just listening to the audio version of the podcast and you've been listening for a minute, I love to bring up two of my least favorite publications: The Economist, which we're looking at right now, and The Atlantic Council, a really effed up think tank. So first of all, we're looking at The Economist. It asked the question, and this was published less than 24 hours ago: will a humiliated Iran choose a nuclear bomb or a love bomb? How 30 years of strategy blew up in the regime's face. So basically, the article is the Israelis Khomeini once vowed, would be made to understand the power of Iran. What that meant was up to others to decide. But such indecisiveness is no longer sustainable, asserts this Economist piece. The Israeli airstrikes on October 26th, retaliation for an Iranian ballistic missile barrage on October 1st, had significance far beyond their military impact. They signaled the failure of Iran's national security doctrine. The strategy that Mr. Khomeini pursued for decades has fallen apart, and Iran's 85-year-old leader seems incapable of charting a new course. What are they actually talking about here? It seems like utter nonsense. What?
I don't even know where they're basing their information, their analysis on. They have not actually provided any sort of factual input to be able to therefore come to the particular sort of opinionated conclusions that they've come to, which is, rather the modus operandi of a lot of these Western outlets anyway.
Yeah. So basically, here is, I just wanted to chart, and we've talked about this a number of times, the inherent contradiction that Iran holds inside the Western media apparatus, that it is at one time a very fragile post-revolutionary state that has a tanking economy. It's on the brink of civil war and popular revolution and regime change, and we just need to help it. We just need to bomb it a couple times and set things in motion, and it will all, sort itself out. It'll be replaced by a more pro-Western government, pro-Israel government, and that will be that. And at the same time, the massive contradiction is Vice President Harris said in an interview 3 weeks ago that Iran was America's greatest adversary, even though it poses no existential threat to U.S. sovereignty. It's not an economic peer like China. It's not a military peer like Russia with its massive nuclear arsenal that could, with our help, wipe out the world. It's just a regional power, and they that is at one time so weak it's about to fall, but at the same time so powerful that it has this entire tentacle octopus of terror that's able to destabilize and reshape the entire Middle East. So which one is it? So I would just like to point out, when they say Iran's nuclear national security doctrine has been shattered by these Israeli airstrikes, I'm first of all like, how? Second of all, this is the same publication that said consistently for years, at least over 2 years, that the ruble was about to collapse, the Putin quote unquote regime was about to topple, Russia's completely isolated, which we'll get to in a second with BRICS. It's not. Hint, foreshadowing. These are the same publications that say the exact same thing. They're never rooted in any sort of reality at all. So what is it? Is it Iran's about to collapse, or Iran's the greatest threat to U.S. national security that exists? Because it seems like you can't have it both ways. So what did the strikes actually accomplish based off what I've seen? The Associated Press published some open source image intelligence satellite photographs from one of those open source companies. I forget what it's called now. And I looked at two secret bases. I didn't see any significant battle damage. Maybe like a couple buildings got leveled. We know they had an early warning radar site in Syria leading up to the attack. They hit other targets in Iraq. They presumably hit at least one air defense battery inside Iran, which killed presumably 4 soldiers. But beyond that, that's really all we know. So if it was significant, like actually significant, that's not something they would be able to hide. So at least it was nominally effective. I guess they put rounds on target, but did it accomplish anything? Did it overthrow their national security doctrine? Like, what are they even talking about here, Elena?
They don't even know what they're talking about. Right. So you made a great point about the inherent contradictions of a lot of Western media. And this is something that is pretty much become their main sort of code, or rather their main sort of approach to discussing any country that's an adversary. They do exactly the same thing, like you said, with Russia. They've done exactly the same thing with Iran. They do exactly the same thing with China's economy. On the one hand, China's economy is basically shrinking. They're going to the economy of China will no longer grow as it was, and it's going to deplete itself. But then on the other hand, China is also the greatest threat to the United States and the Western world in terms of its economic capabilities. The same thing applies for Russia with regards to its military capabilities. On the one hand, Russia didn't have any ammunition left. Its military was depleted. But on the other hand, if Russia was to succeed in Ukraine, it's also going to invade and take all over the EU at the same time. But either they are so weak they can't even beat Ukraine, or they're so powerful that they're going to take over the entirety of the EU. These are the constant contradictions that you find in Western mainstream media, because they don't actually publish information that's based on rational sort of analysis, but more so sensationalism in order to camouflage whatever it is that they're trying to camouflage in that point in time. So, for example, in the case of Iran at this present time, because Israel's, I guess, attack on Iran was so, my humble opinion, very limited and did not in any way shake Iran, they need to therefore present Iran as having been so essentially destroyed and such a weak state that effectively, it sort of demoralizes the entire country so that they can elevate what Israel has done and obviously the Western powers at the same time. But when Iran was the one carrying out the strike, you had Kamala Harris, as you said, come out and say, well, look, the greatest threat to the United United States right now is Iran. So the narrative keeps changing based on whatever it is that the agenda is that they're trying to promote in that point in time. There's no consistency. Do not expect consistency when it comes to Western mainstream media. There is no rationality. It's just about pretext, and it's just about shaping the narrative, because unfortunately as well, a lot of people do have short-term memories, generally speaking. So they'll take that information, and that information will become gospel, regardless of the facts or whatever is going to happen afterwards. Now, with regards to the Israeli attack on Iran, I mean, it was incredibly limited in its scope. In my humble opinion, I don't really think it had any sort of major national impact on Iran. Like you accurately said, if it had done so, it would not be easy to camouflage. We would have seen the repercussions of that. But what was most interesting as well, I mean, is that Israel actually did use, I think, 100 fighter jets in order to execute this operation, which is rather extensive for Israel. And I think this is the bulk of what it can actually achieve. And if anything, in my humble opinion, I think it proves the incredible, like the weakness of the Israeli military as it currently stands. I mean, you saw Iran's retaliatory attacks against Israel. And by the way, I also like how Western mainstream media constantly try to present what Israel did as a retaliatory attack. It wasn't. Iran's attack were a retaliatory attack in response to consistent attacks against Iranian officials, including obviously the killing of Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran, therefore demoralizing the Iranian state and its national security. So they had to actually effectively hit Israel as a deterrence policy. What Israel has done again is try to essentially initiate yet another new attack on Iran. Whether it be performative or not is a bit of a different story, but that's essentially what it was. But the point I'm trying to make is that Iran rained down hundreds of missiles on Israel, which the whole world was able to see, and it did hit targets, and we know that it hit very significant targets in Israel, and they weren't able to camouflage it. So we know that Iran's abilities were actually very potent, and that was still only just a fraction of what Iran is capable of. Whereas what we saw with Israel, and I'll just wrap that up, I feel is the maximum as to what Israel can give in this particular context.
Well, here's the reality. If they really got into it, Israel and Iran would be in a distance conflict. No, they're not going to invade each other. Neither country at the moment has the capacity to do so. So it'll be Iran shooting ballistic missiles, and Israel, because it has a very small ballistic missile arsenal, will be doing bombing sorties, presumably. Now, that's dangerous. It's expensive. It's far more expensive to do that than shooting ballistic missiles. It's not as sustainable. You could lose pilots. Very complicated aircraft that require maintenance. And guess what? A lot of those F-35s, unless they're heavily modified, cannot reach Iran and get all the way back to Israel. So what we saw transponders for about 10 Stratotankers. And let me pull it up right here. This is a U.S. Air Force Stratotanker. You see, if you're just listening to the audio, it's this massive kind of like American, like it looks like an airliner, but there's a massive fuel thing. Sorry, I don't know what that's called. A fuel attachment that the fighter flies up to, refuels midair. So, I mean, apparently, they presumably had to do refueling operations over Iraqi airspace. So just think about like the complexity of that operation, having like what potentially 10 Stratotankers refueling multiple fighter wings over Iraqi airspace just so they could send a limited payload into Iran and then return. And that's it. That's like one per night. That's like one attack per night. But Iran presumably could send wave after wave after wave pretty rapidly for a lot cheaper, a lot less logistics. And of course, Israel's proven that its air defense system doesn't really work. And what we know is that the Russian stuff, of course, Ukrainian ordnance penetrates it often, but it's also like near peer or peer to what the Israelis have. So it's just not. Of course, it would be limited because there's a massive difference in capability and capacity. A lot of the Russians, the Iranians, they've been under economic sanctions. They've And so the Chinese, they've prioritized making things cheaper and more sustainable economically and operationally than having the most advanced fighter craft. And so that right there is, a difference in capability. And now it's kind of biting the Israelis because they'd be much better off in a distance conflict with a larger rocket arsenal, which they don't have. They're stuck with these incredibly expensive, fancy fighter jets that can't necessarily get there and back again. So, yeah, of course. And we also talked about they wanted it to be limited because elections, November 5th in America.
Exactly. I mean, you do not want to escalate a conflict with Iran at this point in time, which Israel wouldn't be able to do on its own. If it was ever to actually escalate, it would need the actual more potent support of the United States if it was even able to actually conduct such an operation. Israel has not had the capability. It doesn't even have the manpower. It doesn't have the air defense systems. It doesn't have the ammunitions. I mean, I was even reading articles from from Haaretz, as well as the Times of Israel, that was speaking about the munition crisis that Israel is facing. It's not just Israel that's facing it, but even the entire Western sort of military establishment right now in terms of trying to manage all the wars and the fronts that it's essentially fighting on in, I guess, these kind of proxy operations, because Israel is in a way another proxy of its own. It serves its own purpose in the region. So, I mean, the fact of the matter is that Israel wouldn't be able to succeed in an operation on its own against pretty much the entirety of the Axis, including Iran. It would require backup that the United States would not be willing to take at this point in time anyway, particularly prior to elections. So I think that also played a significant role. Now, the reason I say this is that, as well, I'm still of the opinion that there isn't going to be a de-escalation anytime soon, as in it's going to continue with this back and forth. And the reason is because of some of what's also occurred during the BRICS summit in Kazan, and the significance of, I guess, the economic geopolitical situation that's occurring around the world. But I don't want to just yet jump the gun. But as well, like a little fun fact, for those that don't know, is that Biden actually also invited the president of Cyprus yesterday to the White House in an urgent meeting. And frankly, I believe that this has something to do with any sort of future operations against Iran and Cyprus's particular position, because we do know now that Cyprus is a defense platform, and there is a lot of American and British military activity on the island that's directed towards aiding Israel. So we don't obviously know the details of this particular meeting. We're going to find out, but I do find the sort of sudden urgency of a meeting with the president of Cyprus, of all places, at the White House, at this particular invite at this point in time, to be suggestive of, I guess, certain future plans.
Yeah, I definitely think we can get towards. We can circle back to this at one of the ending segments of this episode, but I did want to, because I do think Iran's going to respond, and then I think that Israel's going to respond, and it's going to keep going.
So.
Yeah,
it's True Promise 3.
Yeah, True Promise 3, here it comes. So before that, I definitely think that's a pretty good segue into the other geopolitical concerns when it comes to this distance conflict that's being established between the United States, Israel, Iran, and, Russia's part of it. There's a deepening security relationship with Russia. Also, like, Iran's an important part of China's Belt and Road Initiative. So anyways, in case you guys weren't tracking, I'm sure most of you guys were tracking, the audience of this show was tracking the BRICS summit, but just in case you weren't, because, taking media breaks is good for one's mental health, I'm going to get you caught up real quick. So Russian President Vladimir Putin closed the summit of the BRICS bloc of developing economies on last Thursday, praising its role as a counterbalance to what he called the West's, quote, perverse methods. The 3-day summit in the city of Kazan was attended by leaders and representatives of 36 countries, highlighting the failure of the United States-led efforts to isolate Russia over the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. So that conflict came up repeatedly at the meeting, which saw its first visit to Russia from United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres in more than 2 years and drew an angry reaction from Kiev. Guterres called for a just peace in Ukraine in line with the UN Charter, international law, and General Assembly resolutions. He also urged an immediate end to the fighting in Gaza, Lebanon, Sudan, etc. So I think it was a lot of great stuff happened. It's incredibly significant, a lot of interesting things. It was historic. Can't wait for a new multipolar world order that will challenge the destructive and self-destructive unilateralism of United States and Western policy. My main two criticisms, though, and I just want to bring this up first because, we can idealize BRICS all we want, but it does have its problems, just like any other organization. So the last BRICS conference was about 14 months ago in South Africa. And since then, there's been an increased de-dollarization rhetoric. Obviously, Russia has hosted this one after being shut out of the SWIFT banking system, having, I believe like $600 billion seized illegally by Western banks, and not being able to get other loans, even from the BRICS New Development Bank. It's suffered sanctions. The main question going into it, or that was going into it, was will Putin and his team be able to come up with a salient de-dollarization strategy? I'm not sure I saw that personally. So that was the main goal of the summit. Well, it wasn't the main goal. That's incorrect. I take that back. But I think people were looking for it. I was just wondering if you saw it.
I did.
Okay.
The thing is, as well, with a lot of the structures, look, these are what Putin had actually suggested initially was he basically spoke about BRICS Pay, let's call the BRICS Pay system, which isn't necessarily going to be a brand new system, but sort of using the already pre-existing sort of financial structures that they already exist in China, Russia, and India, but they're going to expand them so as to allow for easier cross-border sort of financial exchanges that are going to essentially provide an alternative to SWIFT. Now, this is obviously these are relatively new structures. They've existed for the last several years, but they've obviously been their intricacies have been developed more so in the last 2 years, obviously for the most obvious reasons. But already, even when we look at the trade between Russia and China, who have completely abandoned the dollar and are using their own currencies, I think like 95% of their trade is essentially done through these sort of alternative payment systems. It works. And we're seeing the same thing sort of transpire now between Russia and India. And the idea is to expand this towards and throughout BRICS, and the structures are already there and they are rather proficient. There's nothing new that's been essentially introduced. They're basically building on what's already existed, but that they have essentially now expanded to include the rest of the BRICS states, particularly the BRICS 9. We'll discuss obviously the 13 BRICS partners that were also added on in the BRICS summit. But this is one of the avenues that they've taken to essentially provide some sort of alternative, including things like I think it was the grain. I think I have it written down here. There was like a new system for grain exchange, but I've had it written down here, but I've somewhat lost it. Yeah, hold on. Where did I have it? Yes, that's what, because I want to get the name accurate. It's the BRICS Grain Exchange Program. And this is one of many exchange programs that they're basically going to put in place, including possibly like a gold exchange program or an oil exchange program that is going to allow the BRICS states to essentially be able to balance trade deficits and therefore, again, pave the way for de-dollarization to happen. Now, to be able to better understand this, you also have to get into an analysis of the Bretton Woods sort of financial system that was established and why these particular arrangements are rather significant. And although they're not going to be immediately effective, although they have been rather effective, particularly the alternative to SWIFT that's been established with BRICS, but they're going to be significant as the years go on. So I do think it's very important. It's sort of as important as the Bretton Woods conference. I think that the Kazan conference did just that. It's going to be a historical moment where we are going to see changes in the way the international trade system works. But yeah, it requires a little bit more of a explanation as to Bretton Woods as well.
Well, Yeah, we could get into that a little bit. I do think it's important to put on some people's radar. And just the Bretton Woods conference established a system of monetary management that had like rules for commercial relationships among the United States, Canada, Western Europe, I think Australia, and some other countries like 40 to 50 countries. The Bretton Woods system was the first example, I guess, of like a fully negotiated monetary order intended to govern monetary relations among independent states. So, and it was inherently Western. And I guess a
Yeah.
salient difference to begin understanding this one's non Western.
Yeah, but they established the dollar. I think the most important
Yeah.
thing to take away is that they established the dollarization, and they sort of pegged other currencies, pegged their currencies to the dollar. And what that
Mhm.
essentially did is pretty much define the international trade and how international trade would work and how that would effectively impact the economies of the vast majority of the world. And you have to bear in mind that obviously when Bretton Woods happened, it also happened following, for many countries, the post-colonial era. There were still so many countries that were still colonized, but they were becoming newly liberated countries, and there was huge economic discrepancies between, I guess, countries of the imperial core and countries that were gaining their new found liberation. And yeah,
Yeah. And so this is
if you want
actually.
to say something about
Oh
the
yeah,
point,
yeah. No, I'm sorry. I'm not trying to cut off your flow. This was just a great time
yeah,
to talk about the IMF real quick, because there was this massive wealth
yeah, I was going to bring it up.
discrepancy, and there was this
Hmm.
global monetary uh, order or management system being established. They it established also the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, to
Hmm.
monitor,
And the World Bank and all that.
World Bank to monitor exchange rates and lend reserve currencies to nations with balance of payments deficits. And that's where you
Exactly.
trapped a lot of countries in the global south by giving them loans and having them in basically debt servitude for, well, until
Exactly.
now.
Well, that's exactly what I was going to say, because what it essentially did is when you established the dollarization of the global trade, what this effectively did is that when you had sort of industrial powerhouses, as was the United States, who always was in a state of surplus, for example, as opposed to other countries that were struggling, who were not yet industrialized, this created a balance of payments deficit for the vast majority of countries who weren't able to obviously compete on the global market. And then in came the creation of the IMF and the World Bank. Well, I mean, how do you balance out your balance of payments deficit? Here, take a loan. The loan was filled with conditionalities that austerity meant to essentially retain these particular countries to be essentially low value good production countries that will never industrialize and therefore never manage to become equals. And again, when you go back to the economics of imperialism, the very basis of imperialism is to sustain asymmetric hierarchies. And by sustaining asymmetric hierarchies, the imperialist ruling class can continue to exploit and therefore make super profits off of the back of obviously the world's poorest. So you need that economic discrepancy to retain itself. And so what this also does, I mean, when you're from, I don't know, any particular country in the global south, that they're mass producing, and many of them are resource rich, but they could be mass producing whatever resources is that they're sort of that they have the most of. They essentially export it for what is essentially dirt cheap, because the inflation that the dollarization and basically the debt causes to their own local currencies essentially destroys their economies. And it's this vicious cycle of neo-colonial essentially that they just cannot seem to escape. And this is essentially what happened. And the other aspect of this as well is that much later on, because of obviously the war in Afghanistan, etc., saw the United States obviously then become sort of deficit ridden itself, as was the United Kingdom. They went from being sort of surplus countries to deficit ridden countries as well. But because they have the kind of strong currencies that they had, and everybody obviously wanted the dollar, right? You want the dollar to be able to pay off your debt and engage in international trade. So you're buying the dollar, which means that the world in the end began fueling the dollar, which in itself began to fuel essentially sort of the ruling class in the United States, imperialism, all the rest of the world. So by buying the dollar, you were fueling the US to continue wars throughout the world because they needed that sort of financing. So it was a structure that served the financial sort of imperialist elite in the West, and that was what the Bretton Woods sort of structure did. But now with what we're seeing with BRICS, so and this is why it's so significant as well, is that we're looking at the new development back, of course, and then we're looking at new systems of financial sort of exchange that's going to replace SWIFT. But they're also looking at engaging in international trade between them in their own local currencies and taking debt in their own local currencies, which means that they're able to have greater control over their own economy, and this will not create this sort of inflation crisis that they cannot control. And also by having things like the grain exchange program, this also helps to basically balance the trade deficits that could be created as a result of, for example, one country maybe having more of a surplus, about sort of balance payments or surplus, as opposed to another, by basically exchanging, for example, grain produce for, let's have surplus in, for example, rubies. If, for example, Russia and India are trading significantly, and Russia has a surplus of rubies, they can basically exchange it for other commodities that it needs. And this is important as well, because the current state of BRICS, when you look at all the countries that make up BRICS, we're speaking about countries that are basically constitute the world sort of, they're basically a commodity powerhouse. They are, I think, before Saudi Arabia and Iran joined BRICS, BRICS basically produced like 30% of the world's oil reserves. Now it's looking like almost half of the world's oil reserves. Then you've got the fact that, they're also sort of the powerhouse of gas production, grain production, and other sort of mineral resources like lithium. Because you've got Bolivia, for example, who's a partner state. You've got Kazakhstan, who's also a main producer of lithium as well. So you've also got Nigeria, who's also another oil giant in its own right. So you have this sort of organization in BRICS that's becoming a commodity powerhouse, that are establishing alternative sort of systems to the financialized system of the West, that are looking to de-dollarize. It's basically focused on using local currencies. But what this also essentially means is that a lot of these, it means that BRICS will essentially have a strong economic control over the prices of these commodities, which will in of itself weaken sort of the West's ability up until this point to control the world economy, because the prices will essentially be defined by the economic interactions and behaviors of these BRIC states and their own particular trade deals. And the fact that if they choose to trade in their own local currencies, the dollar will no longer be needed. And this is going to shape basically the power of the dollar and the way the world economy functions.
Right. And I would just, this actually kind of brings me to, I guess my second criticism of the conference. All great things, of course. Multipolarity is something we really, in the decline of empire, is something we really celebrate on this platform. But there, of course, are still great power politics at play. So it's a joint effort, but it's still like kind of a nascent organization. So my second point of criticism is basically is regarding the Israeli genocide in Palestine. From this is from the Article 30 of the Kazan Declaration that all the nations and BRICS signed off on. We reiterate our grave concern at the deterioration of the situation and the humanitarian crisis in the occupied Palestinian territory, in particular the unprecedented escalation of violence in the Gaza Strip and in West Bank as a result of the Israeli military offensive, which led to mass killing and injury of civilians, forced displacement, and widespread destruction of civilian infrastructure. Further on in the article, we acknowledge the provisional measures of the ICJ and the legal procedures instituted by South Africa against Israel. We affirm our support of the state of Palestine's full membership in the UN in the context of the unwavering commitment to the vision of the two-state solution based on international law, according to relevant UN Security Council and UN General Assembly resolutions and the Arab Peace Initiative, et cetera, 1967 borders, yada, yada, yada. So they condemned it. They condemned the military offensive, but fell short of naming it a genocide. So they can condemn it all they want, but like 9 out of the 10 BRICS countries, or well, now 13, I assume, have very profitable relationships, like South Africa, #1 coal exporter to Israel. They've got an active genocide case against Israel, but they haven't stopped coal exports.
Mm-hmm.
China and India have companies that run the Haifa port, which would literally choke off Israel because the port at Eilat is bankrupt. We could see them really put the nails to Israel to get them to stop it if they're condemning it, if they wanted to, but there's always a distance between rhetoric and action. So those are just kind of my two main criticisms. I do still think that this conference was an undeniable historic kind of dawn of a new era. It will still take a long time to realize, but it still can't overemphasize that point. And despite all the capitalist trolls lampooning the unveiling of like a BRICS currency, an alternate SWIFT system, for example, the Financial Times just published an article, quote, Vladimir Putin's alternative to weaponized dollar fails to excite BRICS partners, unquote. Anyways, despite all the typical denigration by Western financial media, there is a tangible concern. So for the first time, there's a serious economic competitor to the U.S. and its unipolar world order. I just wanted to offer those two criticisms just because they exist. And I think it's important that people recognize them.
Yes, I completely agree with you. One of my biggest criticisms of BRICS is that, but I understand what they're trying to do, but I would, maybe I'm a little bit more of a radical, I guess. One of my main criticisms is that they really, includes obviously, I guess the main five and the general approach is, I guess they still try to engage in Western diplomacy, and they don't want to present themselves as being rather polemic in their approach, so as to appeal to a wide sort of plethora of different sort of countries without intimidating them, that they have to essentially pick a side. Because you even have to look at, who BRICS, as in even the main five, without the addition of all the other countries now that are part of BRICS, whether they're like the main BRICS 9 or the additional 13 that they've just put in. You've got Brazil, you've got India, that these two countries on their own are rather questionable. I mean, India has been sort of towing between, sort of their allegiance to West and then obviously to BRICS very sort of delicately. But, we saw, one of the other things that came out as well of the BRICS summit was the agreement between the border dispute between China and India, which the border dispute between China and India, is in itself a product of British colonialism. They're essentially the ones that established these borders when they were colonizing both, to be honest, China and India, but it was the first time after 5 years that Modi of India and Xi Jinping had actually met to actually discuss and come to a deal about the border dispute, and they did. I mean, from what we understand is that India said they're going to remove some of their troops, but we don't really know the extent of the details. But it is important because of the particular location of this border dispute with regards to the BRI as well. Yeah. So it's important if we're going to be establishing these particular trade routes, and we're finally seeing some sort of conclusion between China and India. And actually the biggest sort of factor that I guess the party that had helped these two come to a negotiated agreement was actually Putin and actually Lavrov of Russia, which was considered to be a great success of Russia to be actually able to bring India and China to the table to actually resolve this particular issue. But again, India is still a questionable party. And then we have Brazil. And I was going to say about, I don't know if you want to say something.
I think it's kind of cool. We explore the inherent contradictions within BRICS for the audience. I just wanted to mention one more thing. I completely agree about India. Lived there for a while. That it comes back to their Cold War doctrine. A lot of this, it's called strategic autonomy. Basically, it's defined as the ability of a state to pursue its national interests and adopt its preferred foreign policy without depending heavily on other foreign states. What this meant during the Cold War in India, and they really haven't changed that much, was that they would buy weapons from the Russians. Essentially, this is reductive because we don't have enough time to go into it. Buy weapons from the Russians and get military support from the Russians because they had the whole thing with Pakistan going on, right? And then they would develop a free market trading relationship with America. So they've always kind of been in both worlds.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But it's still the case of today. Yeah.
Mhm. And so, and then there's another big point of
Brazil.
contention, and that's Brazil and Venezuela within
Yeah,
BRICS.
and Brazil as well has a long-standing history of being a comprador state for the United States. I mean, historically, and particularly Lula himself has a history of acting on the interests of the United States. I think we discussed it prior to even the podcast, and I just want to bring it up again. A lot of people seem to be, I guess, deceived by Lula, that they believe he's an actual left-wing sort of president of Brazil, and he's this, socially progressive leftist. He's not. He's a social democrat or welfare capitalist, industrial paternalist at best. He serves the interests of the capitalist class with, leftist aesthetics at best. And one classic example can be the sort of U.S.-led occupation of Haiti following the coup of 2004 and Lula's involvement in that, and the sort of Brazil had sent its military force, but it wasn't just to sustain the occupation, but the Brazilian military force had actually engaged in mass massacres against the leftists in Haiti, therefore sustaining Western imperialist control. This is who Lula is, and by blocking Venezuela's entry during the BRICS summit into BRICS, we are seeing Lula basically execute the desires of Western imperialism. And so this is the point. So, because you're absolutely right to say there are issues even within BRICS. And one of the reasons that's the case is because you have so many different, countries that are joining, and many of which, like even Turkey now, who's becoming a partner state and is requested to actually join and become a full-fledged member. And Turkey, again, is also a NATO country. Turkey cannot be trusted in BRICS. So the way that, China and Russia approach dealing with, I guess, this alternative system is by trying to be excessively, in my opinion, diplomatic, so as to not create, I guess, a hostile, polarized world, and therefore bring more people within the umbrella of BRICS. And maybe with time, we're going to see, I guess, more emphatic approaches. But right now, they are sort of trying to be as diplomatic as possible, not to my personal liking, if I'm being honest. I think that they should have been far more assertive when it came to Palestine and what's happening in Gaza. And there's actions that could have been taken by China, like you said, and by South Africa likewise, that they haven't. But again, it's part and parcel of trying to play actually into Western diplomacy, which in of itself is, in my humble opinion, rather problematic. But that's the case. I mean, I don't know if you want to pull out the fact that they've joined, like another 13 countries have become now partner states. So you have the main 9, and then you have another 13 countries. I mean, you've even got, Vietnam has joined, Cuba has joined. These are socialist countries. But a point that also I would like to discuss with regards to the 13 countries that were also now part of the partnership for BRICS, and basically by being partners, essentially means that at some point they're going to become official members, is that a lot of the countries that have joined, and I think we've got, because it's 13, I can't remember all of them. We've got Indonesia, we've got Malaysia, I think Thailand as well. These are also some of the strongest and most fastest growing economies in Southeast Asia. And Vietnam itself is one of the fastest growing economies in the world. I think their GDP growth for 2024 is 6.1%, and by 2025 is going to be 6.5%. And I think their quarterly growth was at 7.4%. So, and their technology industry is actually growing rather rapidly. So that's another factor to also discuss, I think, or actually rather consider, that a lot of the countries that have also joined BRICS are also our economies that are rapidly industrializing and growing, and how that's going to play out in the future is also going to be very significant in terms of the power dynamics and how Western imperialism is how it's going to affect Western imperialism. But again, you can also see the different economic structures. You've got socialist countries that are essentially joining, but then you've also got, countries like Turkey, Iran, Saudi Arabia, all of which are incredibly different. And so this
Then
becomes a
you've
bit
got
ideologically problematic.
some other countries that love the principle of capitalism. I'm making a general statement about India.
Yeah, it's true. Exactly. So it's I mean, yes, but this is part of the whole concept of multipolarity, right? I mean, it's the idea of not having one singular sort of set of values and I guess a system to impose on others. Is that the idea that every particular state can essentially cooperate together without impeding on the other sort of general ideological sort of foundation. That's essentially the idea behind it. How sustainable that is, I have certain opinions, but why it's important, well, from I guess a more left-wing angle, it provides the premise, especially with the type of new trade setups that are being created. I mean, like we said earlier, the fact that you can have BRICS nations now, particularly in the global south, exchanging and selling their products or their produce in their own local currencies means that they're no longer going to be essentially exploited by Western imperialist powers by that deflate their own currencies and essentially they end up exporting their resources for dirt cheap. They'll be able to actually get a far more substantial income that will allow their economies to grow in the long run. And this needs to happen. We need to see the global south grow economically so that economic discrepancies can no longer be exploited. And this could actually pave the way for new alternative systems. But as it currently stands, this BRICS is an allegiance of countries that are all rather different. And unfortunately, that also became rather obvious by the way that they try to diplomatically approach what's happening in Gaza.
What's happening in Gaza? Brazil beefing with Venezuela. There's a lot of stuff. Now, I do want to bring it back one point before we move on back to Iran and its context within BRICS and the ongoing violence in West Asia. Your main point about it's going to take a long time to mature and to grow. That's the main thing. I think unipolarity isn't going anywhere anytime soon, unfortunately. I mean, it's being actively challenged. Like we're watching it unravel in real time, and it's happening faster than I ever thought. And it's happening faster than I ever thought. But it's still not going to go anywhere soon enough to stop a genocide, for instance.
You might be soon enough to stop no, this is where it gets interesting. This is where you can bring it back to Iran. So this is why I'm saying it is why BRICS is significant. Oh, by the way, another important development with BRICS, which I think I would like to tell the audience if they didn't actually read about it or hear about it, is that as the BRICS summit was happening, you had Saudi Arabia and Iran announce their first ever naval joint operation, which
joint
is
exercise.
Joint exercise rather, sorry, and it was happening in the Red Sea of all places, which is absolutely demoralizing when you think about, the fact that the Yemenis have been essentially blockading the Red Sea, and the United States and the UK have been unable to actually deal with that blockade, to now have a historically Western ally, Saudi Arabia, executing and carrying out joint naval military exercises with Iran that would have been unthinkable a couple of years ago. And at this particular point in time, when the United States and Israel are talking about normalization with Saudi Arabia, I think it's rather telling as to the general states of, I guess the West's unipolar influence. It is diminishing at a rapid pace.
I mean, the loss of soft power over this genocide has been insane to watch in real time.
Oh, it is. And the thing is, when I say it's going to take a while to materialize, I don't think it's going to take decades. It's going to be in the years going forward. Because, I mean, even if you think about how much we've progressed, I mean, prior to 2022, BRICS was just 5 countries. Now we have 9 permanent members, and we've just added another 13, of which they're also going to become permanent members. And that's not including the general waiting list of more countries. This was not the case 2 years ago. And because of the severity of the sanctions and the impacts that they've had on the vast majority of the countries in BRICS, we are seeing, and we are, especially China, they are very rapid in their technological advance, and I believe that we're going to see these sort of alternative payment systems come through much faster than anticipated, because they understand even the context of the economic war that the United States is trying to impose on China, which is actually going to boomerang back to the United States, because I mean, if you have 100% tariffs on the production of electric vehicles and other high-tech goods, it's going to essentially affect your own markets, essentially. And China is obviously a major tech producer, and so now you've just created a complex, and basically a complex situation for your own internal market, when people are going to have to pay 100% on any sort of imports from China. How is that going to help your economy? It's going to be catastrophic for the American economy, but that's a whole different story. The point I'm trying to make, you've got countries like China and Russia and Iran who are being so antagonized right now by the United States that they need to be rather rapid in their approach to establish these systems and get them functioning rather quickly. So when I say it's going to take time, I think it's going to be far quicker than people anticipate, because it's a matter of survival. And I know that they do have the technology requisite, I think, in order to materialize them faster than we anticipate. That's just obviously my personal, I guess, prediction. And we can now discuss like why this is important with regards to what's happening in Gaza and Iran.
Okay, so
But
first of all, bring up Western think tanks and media. Atlantic
very good.
Council, October 22nd, a crack in the BRICS. Iran's economic challenges take center stage at Russia's summit. They're trying to say that while the conflict in the Middle East continues to dominate headlines, Iran's economic and energy crisis also poses a significant threat to the regime's long-term stability. Even as the country's leadership navigates internal isolation, internal corruption and mismanagement, and rising domestic frustration, resolving these internal economic challenges will be just as crucial. The reality is that Pezeshkian will show up to the BRICS leaders meeting and look out for support across BRICS, not only in the military domain, but also for his country's economy. This is another ludicrous article. Iran's economic standing within the BRICS, does it pose a crack? Like something I talked about on my show yesterday was, even if it was an issue, which is not, they have a deepening security relationship with Russia. Russia needs its drones. Iran needs its Russia's air defense systems. Also, it's incredibly strategically important for China's all-important Belt and Road Initiative. So, like, the fact that Iran would be isolated from other powerhouses within the BRICS is completely ludicrous.
Most of the most powerful nations in BRICS have all been sanctioned, so they have absolutely nothing to lose anymore with economically cooperating with Iran, which was not the case even 10 years ago. Even Russia would have shied away 10 years ago of working with Iran because obviously they didn't want to be affected by Western sanctions. That is no longer the case. I constantly bring up the fact that 25 to 30% of the world's population has essentially been sanctioned by the US. So essentially it's come to a point where, because so many nations are sanctioned, there's no longer any deterrence to prevent them from cooperating with Iran, which is why Iran's economic sort of standing point has actually significantly sort of bettered over the course of the last few years, and especially now in their involvement in BRICS. And much like you said, Iran is very geostrategically important with regards to the Belt and Road Initiative. And this is why I believe that the escalation between Israel and Iran, or rather the West and Iran, is not going to stop, because, as I've said, I think in previous podcasts, I'll just reiterate the same point here. The United States and Israel, or just the general West at this particular point, there's two decisions. They basically have two choices, rather. The first one is to admit defeat and pull out of Lebanon, which actually we've discussed this as well.
It's
You've got
happening.
Israel now.
Yeah.
It's happening. Israel's
Yeah.
pulling out of Lebanon, stating that we've achieved our military goals. Meantime, Hezbollah is raining down more rockets today into Israel than it did even prior, and they weren't even able to get a couple of kilometers in, which is actually drastically different to what we saw in 1982 or even what we saw in 2006, which just goes to show that Hezbollah is actually far stronger, and they haven't diminished Hezbollah's capabilities, even though they try to decapitate all of its, I guess, senior command officials. It's just proven that it's an ineffective military process, and that the fact of the matter is Hezbollah is still strong. And what that essentially means is that Hezbollah is going to continue its operations. It effectively means that the north of Israel, it's not going to be secure. It means that settlers in the north are not going to return home. And in fact, more settlers have actually left as a result of the, I guess, the increase in the level of Hezbollah's operations in Israel. Yemen's still going to continue its blockade, and then the Axis groups in the region continue to strike Israel. So the only choice that Israel has at this point, and the United States, who back them, no matter what, is admit, I guess, defeat in a way by saying, right, we're going to stop the operations in Gaza, stop the ethnic cleansing. And that's the only way that the Axis will essentially stop firing rockets into Israel, and they can actually safeguard their borders. But if they do that, and this is why I will keep saying this point over and over again, if they do that, that means you've got a region now, basically, well, the vast majority of Western Asian countries, they're going to develop a degree of, I guess, autonomy. Israel has lost its deterrence policy. It's lost its fear factor. You're going to have an emboldened resistance. Iran would have come out essentially victorious. And there's a very high chance that when this ends, there's going to be huge calls for a Palestinian state. A ceasefire is no longer what people demand, but a Palestinian state. And a Palestinian state will also be a splinter for the Western imperialists in the region. So, and if this is to happen, I mean, you've even got Syria, who's now requesting to join BRICS. So, you've got Saudi Arabia who's joined BRICS. You've got Iran who's in BRICS. You've got Syria who's joining BRICS. You've got Iraq, who essentially wants to remove all U.S. bases. They could very easily consider joining BRICS. And so what's going to happen is that you're going to essentially lose Western Asia, meaning you lose the control on oil prices and the oil market and significant trade routes, which therefore diminishes the ability of the West to economically control and assert their sort of, I guess, imperialist objectives over the rest of the world. So in my humble opinion, they're going to continue. And I think a war with Iran is something that they do want. It's not going to be successful militarily. It's just impossible. But the U.S. will have to somehow involve itself. And I do still stand by that, because if they don't, and they allow Iran to continue and BRICS to continue as it currently is without sort of trying to hit BRICS somewhere where it will essentially hurt, well, this is their ability to sustain their unipolarity and their imperialist control over the world will no longer be plausible. And for all the reasons that I mentioned, because of, I guess, everything that was accomplished during this BRICS summit.
So, yeah, I mean, they won't back down in Israel, and they won't back down in Ukraine, because if they do, that's the ending and the death. It's the beginning of the end. I mean, it already is, but it'll just be like plain for all to see. After the ignominious withdrawal from Afghanistan in conjunction, with this failing war in Ukraine, where actually Russia made a lot of ground recently within the past couple days. The Israelis are withdrawing from southern Lebanon. It's just, and now Iran is just, and actually because of this BRICS summit, because of everything that's going on, and the deepening security relationship with Russia and their cooperation with China and their
Saudi Arabia even.
and the normalization, the beginning of the normalization process with Saudi Arabia, which is a huge blow to imperialist interests within the region. They're in a strong position, and I think they're going to retaliate in some way.
Oh yeah, 100%. And I wouldn't see a reason for them not to. Israel is at its weakest. Because it's at its weakest, I would strike them again. I would, and insert even further fear into Israel that they will no longer be safe in the region. And I think this is how this is this is how it's going to continue going. It's not going to de-escalate, but we're going to maybe see some sort of temporary relaxation period until the elections, probably. That's it, or like in the next couple of weeks.
Yeah,
No, it's not in a couple of weeks.
Since it's next week, Alina.
Next week, yeah. Jesus, I lost
God
count. Yeah, what's
help
the
us
day? I
all.
forgot. It's the 20. It's the 20. Oh
It's
shit!
it's
Yeah,
it's
the
next
29th.
Tuesday.
Yeah, wow.
You'll know when you wake up Wednesday morning what kind of shit show we're in. So yeah, I think that everything's going to stay in a holding pattern until the election. Iran, Israel, they've been taking their time and responding during this distance conflict, sometimes taking weeks, sometimes almost taking a month. So
2 months.
2 months. Yeah. So I think nothing to worry about except to get on in online fights in the comments section about how to vote for you Americans. And guess what? Research shows that 99% of people quit arguing with people in the comments sections 3 minutes before they convince the other person that they were right.
Oh, okay.
I'm just kidding. That's a completely made up fact. You're not going to convince people in the comments section to change their minds. But we'll see. Vote your conscience or don't. And yeah, Iran will respond, but we think the next week should be chill. All right. Thanks so much for coming on. We're at an hour, and it's time.
Yeah. Well, thank you for having me on. Yeah, it's always great to be on, Greg.
Yeah, it's always great to have you. Also, I'm going to be offline for 7 days. I will again reemerge on November 6th. We're going to be doing a Q&A on Patreon tomorrow, and then I'm out of here, son. So hope to see you there, and check you all next week. All right, have a good one.